So this is something I've been thinking about. Occasionally what I like to do is in true Cartesian fashion to kind of go back and look at some things I take for granted and then see if I can kind of come up with a more nuanced approach, or if there's counterexamples then I might have to modify my position a bit. So I've been thinking a bit about mono versus multiculturalism. And I think in our current day there's a very logical and rational rejection of multiculturalism, of any idea of having more than one culture within a country, that the nation state is absolute and inviolate, and that any attempt to kind of undermine cultural unity is a bad thing. And I think you have to understand that's not traditionally how it was thought of, at least not really until the Enlightenment and when you get the development of modern liberalism. Truly, there was always this concept of culture, particularly if you look at the Greeks, who were very, very culturally centric and ethnically centric for that matter. And the Romans were similar, and so were the Chinese. That there is this thing that exists beforehand, but at the same time, I think what we have to think of is modern day multiculturalism is something completely artificial. Something we on the right have to look at is there's not only a difference between, say, multicultural and monoculture and change and or progress and regression, but that there's a difference between organic and inorganic. Did something come about as a natural result of history, or was it something that was socially engineered in contrast to how things were moving in a more natural flow? So you had societies that were more naturally multicultural, like the Persian Empire, like China to a certain extent, various Indian kingdoms, the Arab empires, etc. Well, Arab empires we'll talk about in a minute. The Roman Empire. And then you had states that were more just monocultural because of geography, etc., like Korea. And in a lot of cases, how a state managed its cultural policy and how effective that cultural policy was depended on a lot of different things. There's never really been a hard and fast rule, oh, we're going to not have a dominant culture, oh, we're going to have a dominant culture, oh, we're going to have equal representation between cultures, oh, we're going to have multiculturalism, but it's going to be biased multiculturalism. There's never really been a hard and fast rule. Generally speaking, it works best when it's something that develops naturally, given the local circumstances at that given time. Another thing I think we have to understand is mass immigration as we know it today wasn't really a thing historically. You had invasions, but those took a long time, and that took a very long period. Very often the invasions made a much smaller genetic impact on the area than we might think. The people of Turkey, I believe, are still very similar to the classic Anatolians. Obviously, they've inherited a fair amount of Turkish blood, but it's very much a Turkish cultural concept that's kind of come to dominate Turkey. And that's very true throughout a lot of Europe, is you'll have peoples that are almost genetically indistinguishable, the French and Germans, but are defined very differently as kind of a matter of culture. So you have these two aspects to it, where you can have very different peoples or very similar peoples that, and their identities kind of vary. So it is, to a large extent, invasions didn't always change the local population as much as one might think. I don't know how much the Mongol invasions genetically altered, say, China or Persia. Maybe if someone could post a comment about that. My intuition is they largely didn't. They just kind of imposed their rule over it, and eventually their rule disintegrated, and it more or less went back to the way it was. But you didn't really have this large-scale immigration like we had today. Within the Austro-Hungarian Empire, I don't think there was particularly much. Within a lot of kind of the monarchies in Europe that ruled over multiple countries, my understanding there wasn't a huge amount until we start getting into more of the modern era. With some notable exceptions, such as Russia, but we'll get to that in a minute. So in a lot of these countries, and a lot of historic states, how the government views its cultural policy is based on a number of circumstances. Number one, and the most obvious, is how big are the respective cultures? What percentage of the population follows a particular culture? And we can look at that like with regards to China today, where the government has succeeded in having a Chinese culture, a Han Chinese culture, that's what, like 80, 90, 95% of the country. And to a certain extent, they're in such a dominant position that they can just ignore whatever the local cultures are and try to assimilate them, be it Tibetan, Uyghur, whatever kind of the random pockets are. They can very easily just ignore them and dismiss them and not really try to accommodate them. So you have that aspect to it. You have states like that. Then you have states that are more naturally, well, they might be kind of contrivances that they exist the way they do, but you have countries like Iraq, which can't be monocultural, because you have a bunch of different, you have Kurdish, you have Eastern Iraqi, you have Western Iraqi, and there's very distinct cultural and religious differences between these various peoples. And you just, if you try to assert a monocultural identity over it, it just doesn't work. It leads to civil war. The state starts to fall apart. The various factions are kind of similar in strength. Belgium is also like this, where I know people get angry at me, but it's roughly, it's fairly equal between the Walloons and the Flemish. Neither side can really force a single culture over the other group. And then you have other kind of situations like what you had during the Roman Empire, where Latin culture was dominant. It wasn't even necessarily for much of the empire the culture followed by a majority of the population, but it had enjoyed a position of a very large dominance. It was kind of able to steamroll over the others. So hopefully I'm kind of making a bit of sense. My point is, cultural policy is very much dependent upon the time period. Now, kind of some examples of historically failing monoculture was what the Greeks tried to do with their empire. Now, the Greeks occupied most of what we know as the Middle East today, including Egypt. And one of the main problems the Greeks had was they were exceedingly ethno and cultural centric, to the extent that they openly despised the people they ruled over. And I use that term unironically, ethno and cultural centric. The issue is when the Hellenistic population is like 5% and the rest of the country is a completely different culture group, and you're asserting Greco monoculture, you're basically alienating the vast majority of the population. And that was one of the big reasons for the downfall of the Ptolemaic dynasty. Was, I believe, Cleopatra was the first Ptolemy to learn Egyptian, and she kind of started syncretizing with the Egyptian religion. She started to kind of show compassion to the Egyptian people, and they kind of rose up because all the Hellenes were based in Alexandria, and when Caesar came there was a civil war. It also meant that the various successor kingdoms had a very small pool to draw upon for a professional military. They could only really trust their Greco soldiers to fight, and that was a very small portion of the population. And if they could, I guess they could pull levies, but levies are historically awful. Levies pretty much always underperform. And I think that was an issue when you had these paper tigers like the Seleucid Empire, like Ptolemaic Egypt, that theoretically were these huge juggernauts, but in practice crumpled like a stack of wet paper when Rome faced them. I think a large part of it is the local people despised them, and because they weren't willing to make concessions to the local cultures, they weren't able to really marshal the forces. Now let's kind of compare this situation to other empires that have adopted a monocultural policy. Let's look at Russia. Russia, by and large, has always had a very... the book I read about communism called it Great Russian Chauvinism. That is, that there's this idea that there's a high Russian culture that needs to steamroll all other cultures within Russia. And it to a certain extent is more effective because the Russian people have a much more dominant position. Russia has a lot of different minorities and cultures within it, but in terms of political, cultural, social, financial power, the Russian ethnicity has always had a very dominant position. So because of that, they were able to impose it through the public education system, through settlement, through in many cases exterminating or displacing the local population. So even though Muscovy was originally a lot smaller than kind of where Russians are today, they were able to convert large portions that were different cultures and subsume them into the great Russian culture, not necessarily having to syncretize that much. So then you kind of have the monocultural policy in which you actively repress or look down on the others. Then there's kind of some other historical ways countries have gone about it. The concept of a cultural union, which was kind of came about during the Enlightenment in the 19th century, was kind of the idea, and paradoxes, I'm kind of getting this from Paradox, that you take a bunch of cultures that are very similar and you kind of form a union of them. And the union will work, but it will have some respect for the local cultures. They won't necessarily try to stamp them out, but they're similar enough that they can band together in a nation state to kind of protect this kind of vague shared identity. So that was kind of traditionally, that was how Spain worked. You had the different kingdoms that made up Spain. It was a very loose federation. The central government didn't have a ton of power. Local cultures were very important. The Basques were very loyal to the French monarchy historically because the French monarchy was very big into preserving the local autonomy. And under Franco, they tried to adopt kind of a Castilian monoculturalism and try to eliminate the other cultures, and that kind of has what's led to the modern secessionist movements to a large extent, is Franco's attempt to end kind of the organic traditional multiculturalism of Spain. And they kind of went back to that in the aftermath of Franco, and now you have autonomous regions. And Spain was a very decentralized country, but that's not enough for the various composite regions of Spain. And then you kind of have some other interesting historical approaches, like the one the Roman Empire took. Now, within the Roman Empire, Latin culture was obviously very dominant. The Romans didn't necessarily find it necessary to exterminate the local cultures. What they liked to do was kind of go to the local culture, syncretize the local culture with their culture, and then gradually Romanize the area. So this is very easy for pagans to do because pagans kind of have open theism. They believe in all gods. So what the Romans would do is they take the local gods, they'd associate them with their gods, and they gradually start to bring in settlers. They kind of try to adapt the local culture. And from my understanding, while they were very culturally chauvinistic and imperialistic, they viewed it as more of a long-term thing. And there was differences between the various regions of the Roman Empire. But over time, I think the Romans, what they tended to believe was, our way is naturally superior, so people will eventually adopt it more and more. I think that proved true. The fact that all of the West uses the Latin alphabet, that our legal system is based on the Roman system, that our forms of government are based on the Roman system, that the languages of most Western countries owe, if at least a lot of loan words to the Roman system, the fact that they're still called the Romance languages, I think is a testament to how effective this system was. Because while there is certainly differences between the various successor states, be it France, Spain, Italy, etc., they all still use a descendant of the Roman dialect. They still kind of identify with that past. We still use Latin terms in medicine and law. So I think the Romans successfully kind of created this hybrid model where you had Latin as the dominant culture, but you also permitted limited multiculturalism and syncretism, and you let it kind of disseminate over time. See, that's another aspect. There's different ways of spreading your culture. You can have it as an official government policy. You can also, it can just be something that occurs naturally. And that's very much what's happened with Anglo-American culture, is it's naturally kind of spread throughout the world because technical manuals, scientific discoveries are normally in English, movies, books, popular culture is in English, It's such a dominant financial, cultural, etc. language, and the culture is just also the sheer size of America and its percent of the world's economy is so vast that it disseminates that way. It's not necessary for America to invade countries and impose it, or to necessarily do it to ship in settlers. It's disseminated in a completely different way. So you have that. Then you have kind of other forms of talking about America. In America, you had a form of multiculturalism that developed, I think, very naturally. Where you had, if you look at, say, Victoria II, you have Dixie and Yankee, and then you also have Afro-American, and I guess you could say there's like Western American, there's Southwestern. The regional cultures in America are very different from one another, but they're all very distinctly American. They would all call themselves, I'm culturally American, or I'm Southern American, or Northeastern America, or like Yankee New England, but it's kind of all American. So what is kind of the point I'm trying to make with all of this? Other than just kind of rambling and having a stream of consciousness, I think the point I'm trying to make is, as with a lot of things, I think that we have to be careful, at least those of us who are kind of taking a more thought leader, intellectual approach, as to just rejecting things out of hand because they become associated with postmodernity and modern day leftism. So, like, I think we have to be careful because, to a certain place, most societies have a place for, to a certain extent, most traditional societies have a place for multiculturalism. So, I think that's something we have to just think about as we're going through this and we're trying to kind of dissect it. Like, to a certain extent, Canada just had to be multicultural, and to a certain extent that was something that was, bicultural, my bad. Because you had to have a French majority area in Quebec, and you had to have an Anglo majority area out in the rest of the country. And I think that worked pretty well, and that wasn't really an issue. The issue is once we get into kind of more of the modern era, you have all these other cultures that really have nothing to do with it, Chinese, Arab, Paki, etc., that are kind of being forced upon us. And it's a contrivance. There's nothing traditional about it. There's nothing organic about it. It's just something that is imposed on us. And I think that's part of the reason why it's so alien, it's so hostile. Like, because what happened with America is America emerged as primarily English, but kind of a fusion of different European cultures. So when more and more European immigrants came in, they could make a bit of their mark on America, but also assimilate into American culture, because that was just the way it was. And that was just kind of, that was organic, and that was what America was built on. But now you have all these random non-European peoples coming in with completely foreign things that can't syncretize and kind of merge with the whole. I think that's the reason why it's such a hostile concept. Also, multiculturalism is biased multiculturalism in favor of whatever culture isn't the dominant one, which is kind of an interesting and unique state of affairs. I guess the most thing you can say it's like is what the Greeks tried to do. But I think that's the reason why you're so hostile to it. And I think there's a tendency to dismiss states like the Austro-Hungarian Empire and say they were bad because they were multicultural. And it's not necessarily that form couldn't work, but so hopefully I think I'm making sense. This was more just kind of a meditation, just kind of thinking about it, talking about some historical examples, than me trying to make a particular point. I hope people kind of enjoyed it. If you want me to make kind of more free-form thought process like this, I can do more. But anyways, hope you enjoyed it. I'll talk to you guys later.